Okay, so the next topic that I'm going to take us on a bit of a journey on is I've titled it The Transgender and Gender Diverse Learner and the School. What informs my presentation focusing on the school is based on, it's very much it's very much autoethnographic in that I my very first transgender child that I started a journey with was in 2009. And between 2009 and today, the area of my work that has been with regards to working together with transgender children and adolescents and their families, especially in relation to negotiating the social transition of transgender and gender diverse learners in schools, primary school and high school, is probably the area of my practice that has grown the most significantly. And when I started in 2009, I found myself at that stage very much a lone practitioner, often a lone voice, as a social worker as well, finding myself in many spaces as the only social worker in many multidisciplinary spaces, but having my transgender clients, asking of me what my role as a social worker is, and that is to advocate for, to be an ally to, and to be an activist for my clients. And they were needing my help to help negotiate, especially the school space. And so basically, I would partner up with the parents that contacted me initially, and we would try and figure our own way through the school system navigation. And so what I'm going to present here is essentially based on my practice experience since 2009, what my experiences were, and essentially what has culminated in what I am hoping I'm going to publish sometime soon once I get my writing done, is a bit of a kind of a protocol that has evolved out of the actual practice experience of working with parents, working with my transgender and gender diverse learners, and negotiating the school space and environment. So here, as I've said in my introduction, it's a description of the challenges and successes, building towards essentially a best practice model that I have developed for managing the process of social transition for transgender and gender diverse children in the school environment. So by now you've you've heard the legislative background that's informing this. You've heard, Chris talk about, a participatory approach, and we've heard, Simon and share both from an assessment as well as a management point of view, and we've just heard the lived experience of a mother and highlighting, the role of parents and family in relation to the child. And all of these elements basically come together and need to be factored and considered. I found factored and considered in my journey. So in this presentation, I aim to present a description of these challenges, as I've said, based on my practice experience as a clinical social worker working with trans and gender diverse learners and their families, and many schools in Cape Town over the last 10 years. I'm hoping to address the journey, describe a bit of the process and the challenges faced when negotiating the social transition, which we now understand is part of the WPATH standards of care. It is the recommended best practice element when it comes to supporting a transgender child and a transgender adolescent, that that once they have fully identified within their gender identity, and if that their gender identity requires, social transition elements in their journey, that at a point they need to have socially transitioned in all areas of their lives. And that would then include not just the family and the extended family and the neighborhood in which the child lives and their community, but very much also within the school environment. And we can understand that when it comes to a school, we're dealing with legislation, we're we are dealing with bureaucracy, and we're also dealing with a very particular type of system in which transgender and gender diverse children and adolescents need to learn to thrive. And as we know, the time spent in school and the school experience takes up a significant part of the lived life experience of children and adolescents. So I'll try and describe the successes achieved in this journey and also the development of a potential Indigenous best practice model for managing this process. So when I started out, as I mentioned, there was very limited work had been done with transgender diverse children and teens in South Africa and in Cape Town. And as I mentioned, my first case presented to me at Triangle Project, where I was a volunteer therapist in 2009. I just want to say, I think, so this was my first case then, but I probably, had one of the most ideal first experiences of supporting the navigation of a social transition of the learner at this point in time was going to start grade 2, presenting fully and completely as a socially transitioned trans girl in her school. And I was very blessed in that it was at a school that was open and welcoming to hearing what we were presenting, and were open and wanting to be supportive and accommodating of the learner. And also the school already had a psychosocial support system within the school that immediately worked very closely with me and resulted in a lot of the early successes in the process that we then started to develop. In all of the cases leading to engaging schools, the parents had already come to terms with and accepted their child's transgender and or gender diverse status, having undergone the necessary psychosocial support and counseling themselves, and their children having been assessed, counseled, and supported by the multidisciplinary teams that were relevant to each of them. So just to say that when I began the process with the schools, all of these important factors were already in place. And it had been the multidisciplinary team's recommendation, and the family and the parents were on board in supporting their transgender and gender diverse child. And that it was understood by everyone involved that the next stage of the journey was going to need to be the social transition of the young person in the school environment. So the parents had accepted the recommendations made regarding their child and wished to support and facilitate their child's social transition in all areas of their child's life. This included their child being able to attend school presenting the gender they felt themselves to be. So the parents requested and needed support and guidance in how best to approach the schools their children were in and would be applying to. Parents also requested and needed support and assistance in engaging with the schools and throughout the process of engaging, negotiating, and setting, as I've said here, up the social transition of their child. So just to kind of, if you hear all of that expectation, just to make it about me for one moment, is I remember when I started this in the beginning, feeling the weight of that expectation, the expectation of the parents, the expectation of the family, and most powerfully and importantly, the expectation of my transgender child and transgender or gender diverse child or adolescent to be able to step up for them and help them engage what for many seemed like a very scary, overwhelming, and powerful system, which is the school system. At that point in time, and still presently now, as I alluded to in my earlier presentation, no National Department of Education, and at this point in time, still no provisional Western Cape Education Department, because that's the province I find myself in, policy existed then and still does not yet exist now with regards to transgender children in schools. So that's also what led to me and the presentation that I did earlier, why I then needed to look at what the existing legislative framework was that existed in South Africa. And as you would have seen from my earlier presentation, the positive outcome of that is that I found that we already had a conducive, supportive legislative system in place. So the parents were very much dependent at that point in time, and still in many situations today, because this policy, the National Department of Education policy, doesn't yet exist. And when I approach schools and negotiate, I'm the one that's needing to present all of these various, elements of the existing legislation to principals and to school management teams. The parents were very much then dependent on what the attitude is of the principal at the particular school. So I often talk about it felt like every time I had a new case and a new school I needed to approach, it felt like I had to kind of reinvent the wheel each time. But I'm hoping that the constant reinventing and adapting and adjusting of the wheel has culminated in the model that I'm presenting you here today. So in my initial strategy, so these were the things that developed and I figured out and then formed part of my strategy as I engaged more and more schools on behalf of my transgender and gender diverse learners. So I had to rely on the South African Constitution, which stipulates under the human rights section, as we heard earlier, that a person may not be discriminated against on the basis of gender, and that this included discrimination against transgender and gender diverse persons, and thus also transgender and gender diverse children and adolescents, as well as, because the legislation talks about all organs of state, so too it applies to the school and the school environment. This argument was strengthened by the existence of the Alteration of Sex Description Act. So the fact that this act already existed at the time that I started doing this work further gave credence to the legislative and the legal argument I would often present to the school management and principals as to why essentially from a legal point of view, it is their it's expected of them, and it's legally they are required to step up and act in the best interest of the transgender and gender diverse child and adolescent. The argument was also formulated that based on the fact that the learner in question had been formally assessed by a multidisciplinary healthcare team, and that in the case of the learner in question, a full social transition was the recommended treatment. And I put treatment, in inverted commas, because we're very much moving more and more away from a, kind of a pathology, mindset. And thus also the child's healthcare right to be allowed to socially transition. So I was able to, and this was something I had to develop initially, was this collective legislative argument that I could present to the principal and the school management team and governing bodies to help them understand that it's actually on them to work alongside us and support the social transition of their learner. My experience gaining access to the principals and negotiating the possibility of social transition at the schools, I'm really happy to report in my many years of doing this work that principals are very much overwhelmingly receptive and open to engaging with parents, and has been my experience with myself. In the 11 years now, I've only had one school actively resist working together with myself and the parents and being supportive of their learner to socially transition. And interestingly enough, they try to use legalistic reasons to kind of get around having to be supportive of the learner. But mostly principals are overwhelmingly receptive. I found that they were open to having the parents share their story of their child and the process they had been through. And this is an important, from the start, my instinct was, and it really became the norm, is that even when parents were asking me to negotiate on their behalf, I always included the parents as much as possible, and with the adolescents, them as well. And I found that it was very powerful that when we sat with, the principal or management teams, hearing myself as the so-called healthcare professional expert present what I had to present, and hearing the narrative of the parents and what the parents are asking of the school, was often a very powerful combination approach in engaging the school and the principals. They were often open to and grateful for, and significantly, I think, reassured to have, as I said, a healthcare professional able to offer additional information and education on gender identity and gender identity, particularly in relation to children. I also found that they were especially grateful and felt more confident, as I've said here, taking the process forward, having the healthcare professional being willing to support them, the principal and the parents, to strategize a way forward, and who would be willing to engage with the school's governing body, the school's teachers, the parents of learners, and the learners where need be. So basically, the initial negotiation would happen, and I would then come on board for a continued journey together with the principal and with the school management team to now roll out a process of navigating and negotiating the social transition process that will ultimately result in the transgender learner being able to be openly and authentically socially transitioned in the school in a way that it is a safe environment. So I'm already going to jump in. So based on this experience, this kind of protocol started to develop. So essentially, the step one of the protocol that developed was, so firstly, the principal and the school management team would need to be educated, as I've said, and need to take a principled decision, not to be too punny on the word principle there. So I would initially, as I've alluded to earlier, I would offer an education presentation to the school management, which the principal would then arrange, often with the parents attending the session too. So where my parents felt comfortable, it would always be us as a team. So there would be the first negotiation with the principal, and then the principal would then often invite us to then, speak to the school management. And please note that one of the strategies I learned very early on is that once we move beyond the principal, I made it very clear to the principal that when we move forward, the principal is taking the principal position that we are going to support the transgender or gender diverse learner in our school. So when the steps that are going to follow, when we are introduced to the management team, to the rest of the teaching staff and parents, the principal, and I would often groom, for lack of a better word, the principal in taking the position and saying that as the school and as the principal, we are here to learn more about how we can best support a transgender and gender diverse learner in our school. And we have these parents and myself here to do the education. But that in principle, the school has made the decision to be supportive of the transgender learner and to facilitate their social transition. The concerns that were often raised and you heard this referred to by the other presenters as well, is that I used to always joke, what is it about, most spaces when I'm addressing transgender and gender diverse persons, be it children, adolescents, or adults, at some point the conversation always goes to the toilet. So they would raise issues around the use of toilets, changing rooms for physical training and PE and sports, and doing physical training and participating in sports. What often I found happen is once you then engaged, the management team in very practical conversations about, well, how can we manage, for example, the establishing of gender neutral toilets, helping, teachers understand that, not all children, for example, want to change in front of their peers. Many children are shy about their bodies and would want to, change in a cubicle, etc. So often what seemed like such huge issues, once practically addressed and broken down, often helped, management understand, actually, this is something that can be dealt with quite practically. Parents of the other learners, they would be concerned that what if parents who have particular religious, cultural, and or personal views and beliefs that they raise as a challenge to this, we would then engage in conversations around that. And as we know, in South Africa, we live in a country where, the state and church is separated. And so I would engage the team in the conversation that, parents and people have the right to their religious, cultural, and other beliefs, and that we will engage them in conversation and link them with, with other resources, but that essentially these beliefs cannot dictate and usurp the human rights and the rights of the transgender child and learner. In cases where the child would transition, so this would be, especially in high schools, there would be transgender learners that would prefer to transition. They used to use the word stealth, but I don't like that concept because it's associated with, you know, things like lying and etc. I talk about confidential transitions and open transitions. In cases where, especially in high schools, trans learners maybe decide to start at a new school and they wish for their gender identity status to be confidential, meaning that, you know, to their fellow peers, most of the teachers, they're just known as the boy or girl they're presenting as in the school, that we would need to kind of negotiate different pathways for the learner that's whose identity is going to remain confidential in the wider school environment, and versus the learner that's choosing to openly transition in the school environment and negotiate those processes. But often they would raise concerns around bullying and the fellow learners being informed and educated, where, as you will see later, we then have developed programs or presentations that are offered to both the learners as well as the parents in furthering their education. It was important that the school management team then take a decision in principle that they will support the learner and take the position from the perspective of the learner's human rights and their healthcare rights, and that the school management will be supporting this learner in their process forward. And this would very much be part of what I'm trying to establish and articulate and make sure that the principal and the management team take on board as their position. Then step two, now moving beyond the principal and the management team, we would then talk about setting up in-service training for the grade teachers, sometimes, you know, just for the grade teachers initially, and then for the full teaching complement, and including the support staff. Because in schools, it's not just educators, you have your counselors, you have your cleaners, you have your admin staff that also will be engaging with learners. So we then, in the step two, would put together a kind of in-service training workshop presented to the teachers and the support staff. So the school management would arrange this, and I would support them in this, and set up an in-service training session for, in some cases, the grade teachers that I've said first, and then the rest of the staff. All sessions would be opened by the principal, and I would coach the principal in this, speaking on behalf of the school management and making it a clear statement to the staff that the school has taken the position to support a learner, a transgender learner, and in respect of their human and healthcare rights. Whether the transgender child was going to transition, as I said, publicly versus stealth, would influence the structure and the content, obviously, of the session. If the learner is doing an open transition, often then I would also have the parents present with me in this in-service training, and they would also have a part of the session where they would talk from their position as a parent and what their needs and expectations are of the staff of the school. The concerns raised were, in these sessions, I found were very similar to the concerns raised in the management sessions as well. And so similarly, I would engage them in the conversation around whether it's the toilets, whether it's around, you know, what other learners will say, whether it's about religion, culture, etc. Generally, I have experienced educators to be very open, receptive, and accepting and supportive. I must say, as much as there is still a way to go, and there is still a lot of transgender diverse persons that face a lot of discrimination in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. My most common experience in the schools have been much more leaning towards openness, receptivity, and actually appreciation of the inputs that we are giving and offering the guidance so that they are best able to support their learners. I did twice. I've presented at a teachers and principals conference, and I remember it was very striking that often after I would do a presentation on, the transgender child and adolescent and the school environment, how many teachers and principals would come to me after a presentation, and say they've had this most profound aha moments because they've been teaching, say, for the last 30, 40, 20 years. And as they were listening, they realized through the years based on what I was describing, that they've actually always had transgender and gender diverse learners in their classes and in their schools. The third step that then that developed in this protocol was then to, now that the principal and the management team is on board, the teachers and the supporting staff have been trained and are on board, then the school would arrange meetings with the parents of the grade, often, in which the transgender child is and will be socially transitioning. So there will be an invitation sent by the principal on behalf of the school management to a special meeting where they are going to be given a presentation with regards to transgender and gender diverse children. So the principal would then be speaking on behalf of the school at this meeting. Again, I've coached and groomed the principal to take up this role. And will speak on behalf of the school management and would welcome the parents to the meeting and set the focus and agenda for the meeting. And also making it very clear, we aren't here to ask parents permission. We are here to inform parents of a development at the school, and that the intention of the meeting is to empower and equip parents with information, knowledge, and support. So importantly, as I said, the principal would make it clear that they are being informed of a decision the school management has made in support of a learner at the school. The principal would make it explicit that the school, in respect of the learner's human rights and healthcare rights, will be supporting the social transition of a learner at the school, and that this session is to inform them and to assist them with any questions and concerns they may have. Generally, again, similarly across the years that I've been doing these presentations with parents, again, generally the reactions of parents were positive and supportive. A few would raise, religious and personal value concerns, but I have across the board found that even when parents raised, their religious and or cultural or personal concerns, it was often raised very respectfully, and it was received very respectfully by myself and the management team. And we would acknowledge that we know that, because this is new and most societies and communities aren't properly, educated and informed about this, that this does raise challenges, and that we, and we understand that, and we recommend, that, parents, engage their various religious communities. I would inform them that there is a lot of information online with regards to how various faith communities are grappling with and engaging with the phenomenon of gender identity and the spectrums, and that there is resources and help and support out there. But essentially that the parents need to understand that the school space is a secular space, it's a human rights based space, and as much as religious and cultural values are respected, they cannot dictate what happens in a school environment. Then step 4 was then, so now, we've educated basically all the adults at this point in time. The next step that often would happen at this point is, I called it establishing an action team with the school's social worker, counselors, and life orientation teachers. So this is a bit more of the nitty-gritty work that would now develop after all of the various constituencies of the school have been properly informed and received the education information or the psychoeducation needed. So this would then involve a support strategy for the learner concerned, and the other learners would now be developed with the team at the school. This would mean setting up the relationship with whom the learner could communicate should they have difficulties. What this speaks to is especially the learner that is doing a confidential transition. So what this would mean is maybe only the class teacher and say the school counselor and the principal would know who the transgender learner in the school is. And so a strategy would be developed as to, at any point, if the learner feels vulnerable or exposed or there's concerns, the learner knows who they need to go to get support and to get help. And then those persons were further supported by myself as to how to best be helpful and supportive of the learner. But so too with the learners that socially transitioned openly in their school environments. The learner needed to know in the day-to-day running of the school, who were the go-to persons that they needed to go to should they face any challenges, difficulties, or anxieties, and those persons were had access to me for ongoing support on how best to support and help the learner. Then we would set up strategies to support the educators and aftercare staff who are often directly involved with the transgender learner in the school space as well. And we would then develop, kind of more concrete support to these members of the staff, and maybe even more nuanced psychoeducation with them. We would set up strategies on how to educate and support the learners in the class and grade of the transgender learner who is socially transitioning publicly. So this would then be where I myself, often together with the school counselors and or life orientation teacher, would set up a program where we would physically go into the classes where the openly socially transitioned learner is, and we would engage the learners in age appropriate, depending on what grade they're in, inputs on understanding, gender identity, and to be talking about, their fellow learner that's, now presenting in the gender that they are, and to engage the pupils in their questions, in their concerns. And I must say, I think Simon mentioned it earlier, I have found these to be the most easiest conversations to have. The challenges are not the children. The challenges are not the learners. The challenges are most often the adults. Then we would strategize the building in of gender identity into the life orientation program of a school in an age-appropriate and grade-appropriate manner. I would often, offer support for that. There's a lot of material available to assist in that. And then so that they can sensitize learners about appreciating diversity, non-discrimination, and anti-bullying, which is very much present in most schools, but gender identity and gender diversity, and often even, sexual orientation diversity, is not often openly and clearly articulated in these programs. And part of my role would be to help, include this and highlight it within these programs of the school as well. Then educating the learners. This is an area that's developed significantly more so in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, where now I have schools approaching me for inputs where there is not yet, and it's not because they have a transgender or gender diverse learner at the school, and it's as a consequence of that. I have more and more schools and teachers that are becoming aware of gender identity and gender diversity, and are asking and inviting me to come and do workshops for their teachers and management, but also now for doing presentations to learners. So now it's not uncommon that I'm invited, where I'm in a hall speaking to all of the grade 10s, the 11s, 12s, the grade 7s and 8s of a particular school, where I'm doing presentations, where I'm addressing the sexual orientation spectrum and the gender identity spectrum, engaging in conversation and taking questions from the learners. I just want to acknowledge, when I started at that very first school, there was a social worker there, Thickham Pillay, who used persona dolls, and we actually used persona dolls in that very first session. We sat with learners, and I was the guest of a persona doll, and to come and speak to the learners about, that children can be born a certain sex, but can identify as a different gender, and it really worked very well. So I would also then help the school develop content for the life orientation curriculum, as I've said, and then do presentations to various grades addressing sexual orientation and gender identity. And also in step 6 I would also be involved with schools with regards to policy development and diversity clubs. And what I'm talking about here is I would then assist the school management that often ask for help with this in updating the school's inclusivity policies, the uniform policies. They may have a zero tolerance for bullying policies where, for example, gender identity and sexual orientation is not clearly articulated. So I would work with the school management on how they can update these various policies within the school so that it actually, the policies capture and articulate the protections that transgender and gender diverse learners need in the school space. And then also, and this has been a fairly recent development, more so in the high schools, but there are some primary schools, the senior grades in primary schools that are looking at this as well. And this is supporting schools and learners in establishing, and what I've noticed most often is they're calling it diversity clubs. In the US, they have what's known as the Straight Gay Alliances, something similar. But a number of the schools now the learners are establishing diversity clubs. And these are clubs where it's about, and the learners are establishing, and they're run by the learners, and it's about celebrating diversity. And this is inclusive of cisgender and transgender and gender diverse learners. And it also includes, various sexual orientations, but essentially all elements of diversity. So more and more schools I'm seeing are now establishing, where learners are establishing these diversity clubs, which I think is really wonderful and powerful. And often they will call on someone like myself to kind of help them think this through, how they can put it together, and also often would invite someone like myself to some of their diversity club meetings arranged by learners to talk about, various aspects of diversity. And this has been a really powerful recent development for me. So the way forward, we still need to develop the implementation of a National Department of Education policy for transgender, gender diverse learners in schools. This, I think, is in progress. Hopefully the Western Cape Education, we've had a setback that they made a policy guidelines. But yeah, this is still work that needs to happen. The policy needs to be informed by international evidence-based standards and human rights, healthcare rights, and social justice positions. The development of a best practice model needs to be utilized by schools and supported by this national policy. The development of more articulated, nuanced life orientation curricula needs further development, including and addressing discrimination against transgender and gender diverse learners explicitly in national schools and anti-bullying policies needs further development. In-service training programs for the management of schools, for educators at schools, for the support staff at schools, and gender identity sensitivity needs to be rolled out, that it's not just the limited experts that are doing this work. We need more and more, healthcare providers on board, and especially, I think, our social work cadres, and school social work and school psychology cadres, need to be taking up this work more and more, and the development of support and education programs for parents and learners at schools. So, sure, another runaway train. And yeah, so that concludes my presentation, specifically looking at the transgender child and learner and the school environment.